Here is the fugal exposition from a five-voice motet by Palestrina. This passage follows a pattern that is found in many of Palestrina's fugal expositions. The first two voices introduce the fugue subject beginning on C, and the answer beginning on F, one measure apart from each other, sort of like a stretto, or you could think of it as a canon at the lower fifth. A few measures later, the tenors and basses take up the exact same two-voice duet, transposed down an octave, while the upper voices continue in florid counterpoint. If this were a four-voice fugue, then that is all we would need for the exposition. But there is a fifth voice, the quintus, that has not yet entered the texture. Palestrina gives the quintus the answer only one measure after the answer had already been stated by the basses. This means that the same duet has to work as a canon at the lower fifth in the two instances shown in the teal brackets, and it needs to work also as a canon at the upper octave, shown in the orange bracket. If we consider the teal canon to be the original form, then the orange canon is an inversion at the upper 12th of the original. The rest of this video will be aimed at explaining the technique of invertible counterpoint at the 12th. Here is the fugue subject by Johann Joseph Fux that we've seen in several of the previous videos. And here's the countersubject that Fux composed to demonstrate invertible counterpoint at the 12th. Instead of transposing the countersubject down a 12th to create an inversion, I'm going to transpose the fugue subject up a 12th, so that it now begins on scale degree 5. This shows one of the most useful features of this kind of counterpoint. The same countersubject can accompany both the fugue subject and the fugue answer if it is composed in invertible counterpoint at the 12th. We can construct a chart that shows how the intervals formed between the subject and countersubject will change upon inversion. Notice that the first interval in the original, of an octave above, became a fifth below in inversion. A third above became a tenth below, etc. The only problematic interval when composing above is the imperfect consonance of a sixth, which inverts into a seventh, which is a dissonance. This means that all of the sixths composed above the fugue subject must be treated not as an imperfect consonance, but as if it was a dissonance. The only sixth that Fux uses in his countersubject occurs on beat 4 of the second measure, and it is treated as if it were a passing tone, so that the resulting seventh does behave as a correctly treated dissonance. Before looking at the fugue Fux composed using this subject and countersubject, a few more words need to be said about suspensions in this form of counterpoint. The 4-3 suspension above inverts into a perfectly well-behaved 9-10 suspension below. And the 9-8 suspension above inverts into a 4-5 suspension below. However, the 7-6 suspension, which is ordinarily so useful, inverts into a consonant suspension of a sixth, moving to a dissonant seventh. There are at least two ways that we can manage to use a seventh as a suspension dissonance. The first would be to treat the sixth as if it were a second species passing dissonance, so that the seventh also occurs in passing. The other possibility would be to allow the lower voice to move at the same time that the suspension resolves down by step, so that the interval of a sixth is entirely avoided. By the way, invertible counterpoint at the 12th is very closely related to invertible counterpoint at the 5th, but the chart of intervals is slightly different. The invertible part of this chart looks like all the others we've seen in previous videos, counting in this case down from 5 in the upper row and counting up from 1 in the lower. But for any interval larger than a fifth, transposing the upper voice down a fifth or the lower voice up a fifth will not result in the voices crossing over one another, and the intervals will not actually invert. Instead, for this non-inverting area of the chart, the intervals will change into the octave complements of the equivalent intervals of the chart for invertible counterpoint at the 12th. This means that in invertible counterpoint at the 5th, a dissonant ninth above will transpose into a perfect fifth above, and a perfect octave above will transpose into a dissonant fourth above, which is the opposite of what happens in invertible counterpoint at the 12th. This small difference is important to keep in the back of one's mind, and an example of invertible counterpoint at the 5th will occur in the fugue analysis at the end of this video. Here is the fugue that Fux composed using this countersubject. The exposition begins with the alto taking the subject in measure 1 and continuing with the countersubject a fifth below the soprano's statement of the answer. The bass then enters in measure 9 with the subject, and the soprano accompanies with the countersubject 2 octaves above. Notice that both statements of the countersubject begin with the note D, but the first version occurs below the answer and the other occurs above the subject. Fux then introduces the tenor with another statement of the subject, which is a bit unusual. Most expositions alternate subject and answer, and we would have expected the tenor to have taken the answer here. But if that had been the case, the bass voice's statement of the countersubject a fifth below the tenor would have repeated the countersubject verbatim for the third time in a row. So perhaps that is why Fux preferred to use this version, which requires a transposed countersubject that now begins on G. Fux then continues with 2 additional statements, this time the soprano taking the answer in measure 18, while the tenor accompanies with the countersubject a fifth below. And then in measure 22, the bass takes the answer with the soprano taking the countersubject an octave above. This leads into the first cadence of the piece in the key of the dominant. In the middle section, Fuchs finds some interesting ways to include the countersubject in and among various stretto entries. The tenor, alto, and soprano take the answer, subject, and answer, respectively, in stretto with one another. The bass accompanies first with an inverted form of the countersubject, and then a slightly altered form of the countersubject that does not end with a suspension. A short episode connects this set of entries to the next set of entries, where the tenor takes the countersubject while the other voices continue in florid counterpoint. Beginning in measure 37, the soprano and tenor take the subject in parallel tenths, although the tenor starts on the last quarter note of the measure. The alto and bass then take the abbreviated form of the countersubject from the previous set of entries, also in parallel tenths. In the final section, the soprano begins with the answer, while the bass takes the countersubject a twelfth below. And the same pattern is repeated a few measures later, but now transposed up a fourth, so that the soprano takes the subject. In between these two soprano statements, the alto uses the countersubject as connecting material. This means that the fugue does not contain any freely composed episodes, but instead uses the countersubject in its episodes. And here is the whole fugue from beginning to end. Lastly, let's look at an instrumental fugue by J.S. Bach that uses a countersubject invertible at the 12th. Invertible counterpoint at the 12th was much more common in Renaissance polyphony than in the music of later eras, but it still can be found in some of the fugues of the Baroque and Classical eras. Here is the subject from the fugue in B major from the second book of the Well-Tempered Clavier. This fugue is somewhat unusual in that Bach composes two different countersubjects. The second countersubject is the one that we are interested in, and it goes like this. We can tell at a glance that this countersubject works in invertible counterpoint at the 12th because it simply does not contain any sixths. And here is the countersubject inverted below the answer. This version of the countersubject sometimes uses the interval of a unison, which can be awkward to play on a keyboard instrument, so Bach only chooses to use this inversion once in the fugue. Instead, he more often adds an octave between the subject and countersubject, so that technically the inversion happens at the 19th, which is a 12th plus an octave. Bach also uses at one point this form of the countersubject, which brings the voices one octave closer together and produces voice crossings. And finally, here is the completed fugue with some annotations on the score. The second countersubject is not introduced until measure 28.